Viewers, in just 1 second, you will see a man on your screens. His name is Ted Bundy, one of America's most notorious serial killers from the 1970s. Ted Bundy confessed to at least 30 murders before his execution, but experts believe that the true number of his victims could be far higher. Bundy was known for his chilling ability to manipulate, often pretending to be injured or posing in his authority figure to gain the trust of his victims. Once they were isolated, he would brutally bludgeon them and then take them to remote locations where he would commit unspeakable acts of sexual violence before killing them. Even more disturbing, Bundy would return to the bodies of his victim, grooming them and performing further sexual acts until decomposition or destruction by animals made it impossible for him to engage further. Authorities say that Bundy decapitated at least 12 of his victims, keeping their severed heads as gruesome mementos in his apartment. On several occasions, he reportedly broke into homes at night, brutally attacking his victims in their sleep, bludgeoning, maiming, strangling, and sexually assaulting them. In 1975, Ted Bundy was arrested and jailed in Utah on charges of aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. His arrest led investigators to link him to an ever-growing list of unsolved homicides across multiple states of the United States of America. While facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy orchestrated 2 daring escapes. He went on to further commit assaults in Florida, including 3 more murders before being recaptured in 1978. For his crimes in Florida, Bundy was sentenced to death 3 times over in 2 separate trials. His sentence was carried out in the electric chair at the Florida State Prison on the 24th of January, 1989. It was cases like Ted Bundy that prompted America to begin its largest ever study into the minds of psychopaths and sociopaths. In the early 1970s, America saw a sharp rise in the number of serial killers, with 605 cases compared to 217 in the 1960s. As the term serial killer started gaining recognition, FBI Special Agent Howard Tetton and his team began exploring the psychological aspects of these criminals. In 1972, they established the Behavioral Science Unit, later known as the Behavioral Analysis Unit. Agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler conducted interviews with 36 of that era's most notorious serial killers. In the 1980s, the number of serial killers touched 768 in America. At a 1983 hearing on serial murderers, US Congress discussed the plan for a National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, NCAVC, a resource center to help agencies deal with violent crimes by assisting with training, research, and criminal profiling. They also discussed the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, a data information center to collect, analyze, and provide reports on violent crimes from local agencies. FBI Executive Assistant Director John Otto told members of Congress that statistics from the past decade show that violent crimes like serial murders represent a serious challenge to the local law enforcement community. Otto went on to provide the 1974 example of such a serial killer. First, 10 women in Washington state vanished in 8 months. Then a similar case of disappearing women occurred in Utah. Otto, ladies and gentlemen, was talking about the now infamous Ted Bundy, the man whose crimes I explained in the very beginning. Before his execution, FBI agents interviewed Bundy while developing their criminal profiling techniques. The woman who then assisted the FBI in its psychological profiling of serial killers like Ted Bundy was the lady you see now on your screens, Ann Burgess. Burgess had pioneered assessing and treating trauma in rape victims. The FBI was interested in doing similar research to Burgess, except with perpetrators rather than the victims. Burgess was granted access to the early cassette tapes that were recorded during the first serial killer interviews, such as discussions with Edmund Kemper, Ted Bundy, and Charles Manson. These interview tapes, however, missed essential questions and information. The first serial killer that Burgess consulted on was John B. Simonus, also known as Louisiana's ski mask rapist. Simonus confessed to over 80 rapes across 12 states. During her interviews, Burgess encouraged victims to share their stories, which helped identify Simonus's pattern of targeting wealthy women. Burgess surmised that he would perhaps be driving a flashy car. Her profiling led to Simonus's arrest. He was sentenced to 18 life terms plus 2,406 years in prison. And that marked the beginning of a new era of criminal profiling for the United States of America. Today, I'm being joined by Dr. Ann Burgess herself as India grapples with the rise in crime against women. I'm going to welcome Dr. Ann C. Walbert Burgess, an American researcher, renowned psychologist and profiler of serial killers, with us on NewsX. Ma'am, thank you so much, firstly, for joining us. I want to begin by asking you, Dr. Ann, please tell our audience here in India how exactly you got started with working with trauma and rape victims.
Well, my work in this area actually started with a project that my partner and I started at Boston City Hospital, seeing anyone coming in with a complaint of rape. So it was really over a 1-year period that we saw 146 people between the ages of 3 and 73 that had had a complaint of rape.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, when I was reading about your work, ma'am, I also saw that what made your study stand apart from the rest was the fact that you were able to somehow quantify the trauma of rape victims, even though it is, of course, every case we believe today is different. Every experience, every emotion felt has to be different, but you were able to somewhere quantify it. What system of quantification and categorization, ma'am, did you develop?
Yes, at the time that we did the study, that is what started my work in this area of understanding the implications of rape to women. It was a problem in our country, of course. Not that it has become any easier, but at least we started to understand what happened to someone that was raped. But from that study, the more important part was what was causing it. So our study on rapists, men who primarily went out to rape women, became very important. And that's what really drew me to the FBI study on profiling.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, of course, I would want you to explain to our Indian audience, ma'am, a little bit more about how you got involved with the Behavioral Sciences Unit of the FBI.
Oh, they had a mandate at that particular time. This was in the early 1970s. They had a mandate because of the women's movement was putting a lot of pressure on Congress to do something about the problem of rape. And so the head of the FBI was a new person, a William Webster. He was brand new, young, very bright, very forward thinking. And so he said, we must train our special agents because they had no specialized unit for this. And so I was called down to lecture to them on the problem of rape and what we were finding in our study. And that was giving the special agents information about the victim because they were had not any kind of information about that. And that's really how I was invited down, and it was decided to expand into studying offenders, criminals. And that's where it was a criminal personality profile project that I started with Bob Ressler and John Douglas at the FBI Academy.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, what exactly then were your learnings about the psychosis then of sexual predators, their psychology?
Well, we learned a number of things about sexual predators, but most of all, we learned that there is no one single pattern. There are several patterns. And that's what became important of how to identify the type of offender. That would then direct the agent to look for more of a wider scope, if you will, of offenders. And we essentially had identified about 4 major types, uh, and also eliminated the myth, the bias, if you will, that rape was a sexual crime.
Okay.
It was much more a crime of dominance, power. Uh, of course, it happened within a sexual context, but the psychological motives were much more related to being in control, being powerful, and selecting someone that they could dominate.
And ma'am, at the same time, Dr. Burgess, what exactly have we learned about people then who become rapists and murderers?
Well, we've learned several things. Most importantly, we have learned that it is in their head. It is what we call a fantasy that gets developed, and that becomes what they project onto the victim. So it's in their thinking. You have to understand their thinking patterns, and we are now in another phase of our subject looking at the kinds of things that are posted on social media to see if we can identify early someone that is going to be a predator.
Excellent, yes.
However, there are 4 different types. I was going to say there are 2 that really fall into the power area, and then 2 that fall into the aggression, where it's either anger rape or it's sadistic rape. And both of those 2, of course, can have a lethal outcome.
Okay, very interesting, Dr. Burgess, because you're talking about what the FBI is currently also focusing on, that they've started also looking at social media, which is, of course, what is rapidly being used out there in today's world. But I also want to understand from you, ma'am, in a lot of cases, Dr. Burgess, it was seen in the past as well that most people who were convicted as serial murderers or serial rapists, they were pronounced sane at the time of their convictions. So there was no sort of insanity around them. And of course, those terms are very, very technical as far as the medical profession is concerned. But I just want to understand from you, are there psychological circumstances or certain psychological issues or neurological issues that were also found maybe as a pattern amongst the people that you've studied?
I'm not sure it's neurological issues, but it certainly is psychological and emotional issues. What became important working with the special agents is the behavioral aspect. They could identify behaviors rather than psychology. That fell more into a different group of psychologists. But the agents were very behaviorally oriented. So we tried to identify those behaviors that would alert someone to a particular type of rapist or murderer.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, quite interestingly, ma'am, I'm going to come a bit to why we're essentially having this conversation with you today. In America, of course, has a head start because your studies started in the 1970s and 80s. So it's been many, many decades of studying criminal behavior, of studying the psychology of criminals, of serial killers, of rapists and murderers. And of course, you have decades worth of information. But if, ma'am, today in India, we were to duplicate or to conduct our own study of convicted rapists and murderers, how would you then recommend that we go about it? Because as you've mentioned, the FBI is already looking at certain aspects of how the world is today. For example, tracking social media to understand what really, or to identify people who may have tendencies that are antisocial in nature. How would you recommend we go about it, ma'am?
Well, what I'd recommend is first you have to get approval that it is a problem. I think you have done that certainly with not only this case, but I have been reading about on your news networks about it has been a problem for some time. So that they are, as I understand it, looking at safety measures. Those are fine, certainly to put in transportation kinds of things or surveillance or whatever. But the real project is to study the motives and to find out why this is happening. And it looks like men believe they can get away with this.
Okay.
I looked at your statistics and they're really terrible as far as statistics for women. So something it has to be seen as unacceptable. It has to be seen as something that law enforcement can get into right away. And it's a cultural kind of a issue, it looks like, from just my viewing some of your news outlet stories.
Dr. Burgess, at the same time, what sort of knowledge can then be exchanged with perhaps an expert committee from India so that we can also train our law enforcement agencies and counselors?
Oh, yes, I think you need to, law enforcement must, not only law enforcement, but all those in the criminal justice system need you have to get at the bias, what we call the bias that they have, that it's man's prerogative or whatever it is. The whole domestic violence issue looks like it's an issue, certainly in this particular case that you're calling about, that there was domestic violence as well as prior events, which I would have suggested were there if you had not come up with a suspect.
Okay, Dr. Anbajis, I know I have a limited time with you, ma'am, but I have two more questions before I let you go. I want to firstly understand from you, through the course of your study, you've also shed some light on what is it that women can do to protect themselves. If you can share the same with our audience in India, please.
Well, women can do several things to protect themselves. First of all, to have well, I would say that certainly to have travel in pairs, I think that's important, although that doesn't necessarily protect the person. I remember one offender that said to me, the woman can do all that she wants to do, but if I really want to do this, I will do it. So that was just an American talking. He was a serial rapist. But I think that you have to look at the vulnerability of women, that they have extra protection. I mean, that means locks on doors, it means better surveillance, it means a more responsive. I think the key thing is a responsive law enforcement. It doesn't look like they are being very responsive looking at your statistics. They almost look like they're being overwhelmed with cases coming in. So therefore, how many women are available to help work with law enforcement? Do you have what we call rape crisis centers in which that they can mobilize and provide some kind of aftermath situations? Those are all questions that you'd have to see if you could put together for a program so that women would feel safe. I think right now that the protests are very important. They must get the attention of the higher ups, if you will, in your government to see they've got to do something. And it's got to be more than just saying that they're going to put some extra lighting or some extra moving people safely from, say, one hospital to another. When you have a workplace crime, that's very hard because people need to feel safe when they're in the workplace.
Yes.
So I think that puts the pressure also on the workplace, which we have had to do all these things in America so that workplace feels safer. And hospitals are places where people can, what we call, act out aggressively for some reason that it can happen, that we need to watch that very carefully. Workplace safety.
Absolutely. Dr. Burgess, before we let you go, ma'am, one last question. What would be your then most important recommendation to law enforcement agencies?
Law enforcement needs the education about the dynamics, what we call the dynamics of rape, of what goes on, how the victim is determined. Most victims we have found have been under surveillance by the offender, that person has watched or knew the routine of that person, so that it isn't what we would necessarily call a stranger, and maybe a stranger to the victim, but it's not a stranger from the offender standpoint. So I think that it's very important that law enforcement have the education about the various aspects of rape. And that's where the FBI here in America had to start. They got lecturers in to talk about the dynamics of rape. not necessarily from the victim standpoint, but certainly from the offender standpoint.
Dr. Anbar, just thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time to speak to NewsX and to shed some light for our audience on what really is already happening in the world. Meanwhile, in an exclusive conversation with NewsX's editor-in-chief, Rishabh Gulati, West Bengal Governor C.V. Ananda Bose has in fact appreciated the NewsX campaign, now demanding a study of sexual predators and creating a list of sexual offenders. He's hailed this proposal as an excellent suggestion. Listen in.
In a concrete, practical step, Governor, should we get the best psychologists, psychiatrists, law enforcement experts to do a profiling of why these kind of criminals act, and how do we then train our teams, our law enforcement in dealing with them? Should we do a large scale study in this country, sir?
That's an excellent suggestion. Excellent suggestion. This issue has to be tackled with all the seriousness it deserves. This problem has to be solved. For every problem, there is a solution. We have to find the right solution. In Bengal, what happens is, some rulers, they try to solve problems. Others try to find problems and solutions. Unfortunately, the second one is what is prevailing in Bengal now. We have to put our heads together, the entire society, the legal system, the constitution. We have to put our heads together and speak and think for the people. They want justice, give them justice. They want peace and harmony, give them peace and harmony. They have a right to live. Enforce that. The right to live is a fundamental right. Is it what is happening in Bengal now? Where innocents are much butchered. Yes, the massacre of innocents. That is going on in Bengal. I have been watching it for the last 20 months, ever since I took over. During the Panchayat elections, afterwards, during the general elections, murder most foul is taking place. There is nobody to guard. The question is, who is here to guard the guardians and custody the custodians? That is a malady which is prevailing in Bengal society today. We have to find a way out. Okay. We will find a way out.
Specifically into crimes against women, she's been speaking, of course, to victims of rape and other sexual assault. But at the same time, she's also pioneered a study with the FBI in the 1970s and 80s, which really, in a way, helped America with coming up with a system of profiling. And as Dr. Ann Burgess also pointed out, this is not something, you can't do this study once and then expect the results to be applicable for decades to come. This is something that they are doing now over and over again. Every few years, they revisit and they revise what really is what's happening, and making it, of course, palatable to what's happening in society at that point in time. I just want to understand from you, do you feel that a similar study in the minds of sexual predators, rapists, of murderers would actually assist India?
Yes, to some extent it would. I have been teaching profiling of criminals to the CBI Academy of India. And my feeling, I've heard her whole interview, in our country, the rapists who indulge in this kind of violent brutality, the factors are slightly different than what you have in the Western culture. Here you have a kind of a very deprived or, very different kind of a childhood. Maybe you had a faulty model in the family, you witnessed violence in the family while growing up. So you get sensitized to it. All right, violence is nothing. It's part and parcel of the family life. Secondly, what I have found among the violent rapists of India, there is a conditioning kind of a thing, They learn. They start with a smaller crime and then it goes on intensifying, grows bigger and bigger, because the punishment system in our country, I'm sorry to tell again, I have been involved with all the investigations, starting from Nirbhaya Kand till Shraddha murder case, Sushant Singh murder case, I would say that's a murder, Arushi murder case, you know what happens? Your justice gets so delayed that the offender feels doesn't matter. If not here, I will still get a couple of years to sustain myself in a protected environment of the jail. I have spoken to the rapists. Some of them, they feel doesn't matter. I have satiated myself, I've satisfied myself. What happens here in the rapist's psyche is, as I said, it's a conditioning and a kind of a auto-reinforcing agent, you know. They are not bothered about, when they commit the crime, they don't think about what will happen to the victim. What will happen to me tomorrow if I am rounded up? What they think is the primary thing for the rapist is to satiate himself. Unfortunately, you will find 90% of our violent rapists, they are failures in their own personal life. And the vendetta, the power, and the violence, when they commit the violence, they satiate their defective ego, you know,
Right.
saying, yes, I am the most powerful person. And at that time, they don't hesitate to indulge in any crime of any kind of brutality.
Okay.
And here, you know, it needs to be reflected. The only component which in our country probably can bring in a little bit of deterrent, immediate punishment. For heaven's sake, don't delay it for 8 years, for 10 years. And you say the forensic evidences, you have the evidences all over. Take this example of the Arjikar Medical College. You have the full proof evidences that it was a gang rape, it was brutally, violently given a shape of a, you know, whatever shape we got the body in. And I think it's a and you know, it need not be only the rapist. I don't feel the Arjikar episode was just the rape. It was violence and there was a motive. And if you fail to find out what is the motive, this will go on increasing.
Okay.
Right?
Yes, I'll come back to you in just a moment, ma'am. I want to bring in Dr. Sanjeev Bagai into the conversation as well. Dr. Bagai, I want to understand from you, sir. How would you suggest then, if India were to go about such a study, what is it that we would have to prioritize, and how should we then conduct our own study? And do you feel that in a country, a lot of times a reasoning that is possibly given is that we're too large a country or too large a population to have rather extensive psychological studies conducted? How do we address these issues?
Good evening. Important topic, sensitive topic, but I'll go one step behind. I would rather have the police force orient themselves, one, towards collecting the samples for forensic evaluation. If the crime scene gets immediately contaminated, if adequate amount of samples initially are not taken, or if they are delayed, or if an important drug test or a forensic evaluation of lab evaluation of sera, of samples or post-mortem tissues is not done adequately, then you lose evidence in the court. The court ultimately is going to look at evidence. That's my first point. The second is you have to have adequate amount of medical backup as a core team to support the police. Point number three is the police, the local bodies, let's say vis-a-vis this hospital, has to have a addressal system where what we call as an action team swings into place. Here, everything was as a cover-up. Psychologically evaluating these kind of people, they come from different kind of personality traits. They have very poor self-esteem. They have very often come from broken families, past history of alcoholism, on drugs, domestic violence, abuse.
Yes.
It's a question of their own non-performance being inflicted on others as a moment of power. So I think a lot needs to be done as a country.
But Dr. Bagai, I just want to understand on the issue of a study, an extensive study to be conducted. Every point that you've raised, sir, we wholeheartedly agree with that. But that also then comes where your focus has been on what the cops need to do and what the forensic team needs to do in order to prove the case in court. My question is about conducting an extensive study into the minds of convicted criminals to understand perhaps some patterns that may exist which can help us take it a step further. Once we have the study, then we can understand what is to be done with it. Perhaps there are some patterns that emerge which then can be, even teachers in schools or at a very young age can be trained to identify that there could be certain behaviors which you need to watch out for. And there and then a child is given the help that they need.
I agree with you. We need a core team as a centralized command center, and then different states can add in a plug-in model. A neurologist, clinical psychologist, psychiatrist. That kind of a setup needs to be done. There would be cases, but we need to identify the cases so that we can study. There is a lot of lab evaluation which is available now, a lot of neuroimaging available now, which gives us traits and trends as to what happens inside these people's mind, be it neurological, be it psychological, be it emotional, be it behavioral. So I think we need a more extensive format. I completely agree with you. We need a more extensive format. We need to understand that this needs understanding. The first thing is to realize that we don't have that much data nationwide on studies which have already been conducted so far, at least in the Indian diaspora. So I think it's an important thing. I completely agree. It should be undertaken. And there are a huge amount of technology which is available, huge amount of digital technology available to assimilate the data and get information.
Okay, I want to bring up the same question with Dr. Praveen Gupta. Dr. Gupta, what are your thoughts on India conducting its own study into the minds of sexual predators? Because like I said, this is not, unfortunately, the first rape case, a violent rape case that has taken place, which has resulted in the brutal murder of a young doctor. What is happening today in the country is that we are mixing up, or rather confusing, two issues. One is of doctor safety, and the other is a pertinent issue of violent crimes against women. So discussing the second aspect of it, of us looking at what's happened in Kolkata truly for what it is, which is a violent crime against a woman, how do you suggest then India goes about in conducting its own study? I've had an extensive conversation with Dr. Anne Burgess, and I was glad that most of our guests were there to hear what she's had to say, a person with many decades of experience in studying the minds of criminals. How does India go about it, sir?
So my thing is that the rape is the height of the violent crime against women. But there are smaller crimes and forms of sexual harassment, sexual violation that prevail in our society. Studies also suggest that a lot of these sexual predators have actually undertaken smaller crimes after which they have developed a pattern which finally culminates in larger crimes or serial crimes. So I would think that we should investigate or study the minds of people engaged in smaller crimes, and as they build up, because that will give us a larger data set of people whom we are investigating, and we will also be able to make a trend of how mindset changes and how mind develops in these people, which finally culminates in the act of an ultimate sexual offense. We have a lot of tools, psychological tools. We have brain imaging, functional imaging, PET, which can allow us to look at what organic brain changes are happening, what are the psychological changes happening to these people, which lead to this mindset, which culminates in a very violent sexual act. But there are many things which are short of rape or which are pertinent, usual, habitual sexual offenses which happen very frequently in our society, which a lot of times we actually pass an eye over and which develops into this psyche, which actually sometimes justifies rape or sometimes tries to rationalize these activities, as we have seen across. So a larger study with broader understanding of the mindset of a sexual offense or a sexual crime, including rape, serial killing, I think is an idea which will allow us to look at our own factors so that we can look at our pertinent own solutions for our own country.
Okay, I want to bring in Dr. PSP Rao into the conversation as well. Dr. Rao, I want to understand from you. Dr. Ann Burgess said that as far as her assessment, a little bit of what she's read about what's happening in India, it does seem to her that it's more of a cultural aspect. Of course, the findings of the American studies were very different. Their focus was, they busted a lot of myths about serial killers and serial rapists, and how there's a belief that all of them either work in isolation, that they travel interstate. They busted a lot of those myths about serial killers and rapists. But I want to understand from you, when she says that it seems as though it's more of a cultural mindset in terms of what's happening in India, how do you suggest, sir, we go about it, and what then should be the focus of an Indian study if it is to be conducted, so that it is actually applicable to what truly is the root cause of why we continue to come across every few months a case that shakes the conscience of the nation. Every few months it seems that the nation is shook, but we don't really seem to be doing anything about it.
Good evening to everybody. I feel that as India forms 1/6 the world's population, that means 1/12 of the world's population are the women of India. So saying that India is too big to do a study like this is actually the reverse. If you have a large sample like India is, you will have a far better result and a far more applicable result if you do manage to do this study. I congratulate the concept that you have come up with, and I hope you succeed in it. And in this, you need to get not only the legal luminaries involved, you also need to get the psychologists, neurologists, and various other people and the activists involved in this. So all the best in that. Now, as far as the whole thing is concerned, one, you should look at from the woman's point of view also. How safe is a woman at home? How safe is a woman outside while traveling? And how safe is she at the workplace? So these all psychological problems, and the study should help women understand when they are liable to land up with a bigger crime, so that at the early stage itself, they will be able to either ask for protection or take help. Then the legal luminaries, the police, the judicial system also need to be educated and sensitized to this problem. As of now, like Dr. Datta said, the punishment side is very weak. This also needs to come up. So if you are talking about prevention, we also need to use the stick to ensure that people who think they can get away with it don't get away with it. This is one problem in India we are having, which is far worse than in US, is that the legal system doesn't give, like it has already been said, justice delayed is justice denied. You can't have this thing hanging fire forever. Now, why are these public protests going on? Because they say every time there is a crime like this, there is hue and cry, then there is a committee put up, that committee is looking into it, nothing happens. If those of the viewers who have seen the BBC serial Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister know very well that setting up a committee is one of the best ways of burying something. Because the report from, there have been so many committees, has anything happened with those reports? Nothing has happened. So what happens is public becomes cynical. When public becomes cynical, they don't, they say, okay, we have to just live with this.
Right.
And at the same time, the legal people, if the ones who are not sensitized to it, they say, okay, nothing is going to happen. Now the police, now we want the police to collect all the evidence and put it to the court. But many of them are corrupt, many of them are not bothered. They say, anyway, nothing is going to happen in the court. So why the hell should I bother? The court will give bail, and that chap will come and threaten me for having collected the evidence properly. So there is all these things need to be studied, and all these things need to be fixed. You have to fix how women can learn to protect themselves,
Right.
how women can learn to identify where they are at risk, and then ask for protection or do something about it. Now, if you have people in the workplace who are sexual molesting you or who are taking advantage of you, you need to fix that. And if these women are feeling weak, they are feeling that they may be thrown out of the job if they complain against a colleague or a senior, you need to put CCTV cameras in that entire area and keep check on what is going on. There should be a special team inside the workplace. It may be hospital or any other workplace, specifically meant for this job, where the person can feel safe enough to go and tell that this particular person or this person is trying to take advantage of me. If you don't have that, they are not going to complain about their boss because they are going to lose their job, and then they will be, they don't know what is going to happen to them. This insecurity, if you are saying that the people who do this crime are insecure and they are trying to force their ego, trying to build up their ego by showing their strength, there is also insecurity among the victims. The victims need to feel secure, then only they will complain and they will fight back.
Right.
But as of now, the women are highly insecure. So we need to sort out all these aspects. There is no point solving one problem. You have to solve all the problems. And like Professor Bagai said, you need to also ensure that the forensics are not fixed. You remember the Posh case. The sample was taken instead
Dr. Rao, you've shed some light on what really can be done as far as workplaces are concerned. I want to bring in Saira Shah Aleem into the conversation as well. Saira Shah Aleem, if we were to talk specifically about Sanjoy Roy, who is the accused in the Kolkata rape and murder case. Now, when one goes into his history, there were many red flags over the years. You know, it's only now that he has committed a brutal crime that all of that history has come into the public domain, and everybody is now sitting and wondering, okay, how is it that this man who has a history of beating up his wives, who has a history of violence in his home, who has a history of coming back late and being in a drunk state, his neighbors knew about it, his previous wives, their families have complained about it. He has a complaint in the police registered for beating up his pregnant wife as well, causing her a miscarriage. All of this, and then you wonder, how is it that this man became a civic volunteer with the cops? Of course, that reeks once again of corruption, but at the end of the day, what is it within society's psychology then that we watch perhaps things happening, or we hear things happening, suspicious things happening in our neighborhoods, in our neighboring homes, and we don't want to really say anything, or we don't want to check whether things are okay because we want to believe that it's not our problem?
Yes, I agree with you. See, generally these sexual predators have a history of violence. And if you see, there will be some domestic violence case, or there will be some kind of case. Now, I heard all the erudite speakers, and I'll just like to say one thing. There's no simple answer to this very, very complex behavior, because, the whole issue of sexual offenders or sexual offending is too complex a subject to simply attribute it to a single theory. Okay, we heard everybody talking about different theories and how, India can also do its own research. I think it's really laudable. However, whatever I've heard so far and whatever I know, I feel that the sexual abuse is learned behavior. People kind of engage in it, and if you look at the negative or adverse conditions in early development, you'll see that there's a pattern of, a very negative or poor relationship with their primary caregivers, which can be contributory. So if you look at these sexual offenders, especially when you're talking about this Sanjay Roy, who became a civic volunteer with the Kolkata police, I feel we need to, dig up the history, because a lot of times when we hire people, we don't check the personal antecedents. What were the records? For example, he kicking his pregnant wife. It is alarming. So I think these sexual offenders have a history of engaging in cognitive, distortions or some kind of, abnormal behavior. And I feel repeated exposure to sexually violent pornography can also contribute. Here, if you see, even amongst married couples or people in a relationship, I've heard from women friends or something, if their husbands are too engaged with pornography, or if they feel that they're glued onto pornography, it becomes very difficult for them to have a sane, placid, or even a normal relationship with a wife, because they expect the wife to be, in performance mode all the time. And if that expectation is not met, they go to the red light areas. Like I heard a statement, from somebody who said, "Okay, why do you need to do that? The red light area is there or whatever." So I feel that this repeated exposure to sexual violent pornography. I don't know why these channels or these apps or whatever it is. I don't know why it's allowed. This live streaming. I think it should be completely, even though it's banned, but they are ways on how people can view this pornography. I feel there should be very strict and stringent laws, because viewing violent sexual pornography is a big contributor. Because I heard the main accused had a whole lot of pornography videos on his phone. So that is also contributing. Then again, problems of self-regulation, impulse control, people who don't, they have these sexual urges or impulses, but if there's no control, then it can really become an act of criminality if they kind of act upon that urge or act upon that impulse, which is again very, very, it is an alarming behavior. Then I think short-term relationships and, the patriarchal attitudes towards women, like watching these videos where literally, the man is in the performance mode thing and the woman is, on the, in the other mode. I think it all, boils down to a repeated sexual offense. So I think, if we do a study of the etiology of adult sexual, offenses,
okay.
So I think we will, get a better light of sexually abusive behavior.
Okay.
And the pathways, on how we can deal with it.
Okay, important point raised there. Dr. Jayanti Datta, I would just want to understand from you as well, ma'am. A lot of times, yes, a lot of people today are also bringing up this excessive consumption of porn, especially violent porn. I just want to understand from you. Now, not everybody who's had a troubled childhood will necessarily end up becoming a serial killer, or a serial murderer, or a serial rapist. Not everybody who's consuming porn is also then committing acts of violence against women or any gender for that matter. I want to understand from you, would a study of sexual predators in India help somewhere identify certain predispositions that actually trigger in a person's brain the urge to commit a brutal, heinous crime that people like you and I would it is unthinkable for us. The things that these people do.
Even to conceptualize, I would say one should go really into the psychosocial dynamics. Now, over the more than 4 decades of my teaching in Delhi University and being advisor to so many things, let me, in this August forum, let me share one instance. I've been an advisory of, against the sexual harassment with International Red Cross. And recently, HOD of ENT, mind you, we have doctors in the panel, of a government hospital, came to me saying there is a man, there is a lab assistant who is teasing me, who is shadowing me, and, passing lewd comments. Now I said, raise it to the MS. It was raised to the MS. It was raised to the secretary. I'm not telling you which hospital. It's a government hospital. Unfortunately, no action was taken. There are stipulations, if written complaints, she gave a written complaint. if the written complaint is received by the MS, immediately he has to take action. The person against whom the complaint is there has to be sent on leave. Nothing happened. So any day, if you can really bring about a study, but what needs to be done is the implementation. If you look at this, Arjikar, not only that, even, the children in the schools, you have plenty of cases, starting from Bangalore to the recent case of Pune. I was interviewed for that also. They don't spare even the 3 years old child. Mind you, the rapist has only one small window for understanding the superego. That is the penalty. Penalization is so unfortunately delayed. See, the person who brought Shraddha's body into 35 pieces, he killed Shraddha and brought it into, he cut them into 35 pieces. Still, he is, because of the Human Rights Commission and other things, unfortunately, my feeling is, in our country, our legal system, judiciary is more perpetrator friendly than the victim friendly. I would any day welcome. Now, in my master's dissertations, postgraduate dissertations, we have studied the criminal behavior. So you have psychodiagnostic tests, to find out where the rapist really has a erratic personality. Now, this is, as I said, it's an auto reinforcement. They start with a smaller teasing, smaller incidences of sexual offenses, and when they see there is no punishment coming, they take to this. Once a rapist, mind you, I hold on to this statement, once a rapist will always be a rapist. It's a recidivism in the criminal psyche, which exists in a rapist psyche, right? Everybody cannot become a rapist. And any day, this kind of a study would be a very welcome kind of a finding. But mind you, I would like you to do a study on psychosocial dynamism, neurological things, yes. Medical components, yes. But you must have standardized psychological tests also. And for heaven's sake, whether you have Jayanti Datta or not, have a properly trained clinical psychologist. There is a lot of difference when you are, your training is hospital based. I'm a pass out of CIP, Central Institute of Psychiatry, Government of India, right? So I know when I speak. And 28 years of teaching in CBI, in BPR&D, Bureau of Police Research, detective training school. And, I have various kind of this thing. As I said, I have been teaching profiling of criminals to the CBI officers also. So any day, this is a welcome thing. But simultaneously, you must see that the justice is rendered. Justice is not given to our... See what happened to this lady doctor. She has not been given the justice. Ultimately, it was served and she was told,
you're absolutely right about that.
Withdraw.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. But there was a point that you raised. I want to bring in Dr. Bagai back into the conversation. I have a few minutes left now. Dr. Bagai, I want to understand from you, do you feel that if we were to conduct a large study, it could also help raise certain problems within how our society and culture, society is functioning in certain cultural aspects that perhaps trigger people into committing these sort of brutal crimes?
Absolutely. I think the most important thing is that we are discussing this. So I think people should be more sensitized, people should be aware. And these kind of studies will not only give us a neurological, psychiatric, or a neuroimaging functional and dynamic functional studies of neuroimaging of these kind of serial offenders. But I think what Dr. Datta has mentioned, we'll be able to pick up a lot of traits, family traits, behavioral traits, emotional traits, which will tell us about the family, their past background, early childhood. And a clinical psychologist, I couldn't agree more, is something which we, even in our practice, we very often neglect. But it becomes a cornerstone for us to clinch a diagnosis. Because one mind as a clinician does not pick up everything. So I think it's an extremely important cornerstone. In fact, I would say it's the backbone of reaching a diagnosis. These studies will help us identify traits. Early traits perhaps can prevent further crimes. Over to you.
Okay, Dr. PSV Rao, I have just 1 minute left, sir. I just want to understand from you, Dr. Rao, how would you suggest then India goes about this? Because in the US, when we spoke to Dr. Ann Burgess, she said that there was a lot of political pressure at that point in time on the FBI to conduct, to perhaps not conduct a study, but to do something about the rising violent crimes against women in the United States of America. Do you feel that we now need to push our political class as well into action, because all we see around us is silence?
When politicians themselves are criminals, you allow criminals to get elected, and political parties give tickets to criminals. What can you talk about this political class? This is the root cause of a lot of problems. And the judiciary, the selection of the judiciary is selecting themselves. Where, in which nation in this world we have judiciary selecting the judiciary? Where you have got these laws saying that the criminal can't stand for an election, but then that is as long as he is convicted, there is no conviction here. So when you don't convict a person, he keeps getting elected. And how are you going to convince a criminal to have a study like this? It is only public pressure now that is going to save this. And this is why my fellow doctors are refusing to quieten down. They are continuing their protest because they see this is the only hope. We are here to save lives. There are people happily killing and being out on bail. There is no action against them.
Right.
And the person on bail will further threaten you and your family members. This is getting from bad to worse.
Absolutely. It's become a very vicious
cycle has to be broken.
Yes, very vicious cycle, very vicious loop. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. But I promise viewers that we will be taking up this issue on a daily basis. Before we wrap up, I also have with me Dr. R.V. Ashokan, President of the IMA, joining us for a quick chat. Sir, thank you so much for taking our time. We just have a couple of minutes left. I want to understand from you, NewsX has now launched this campaign where we are inviting, or we are expecting, the most qualified medical minds to discuss profiling of serial killers, of serial rapists. Would you be, sir, willing to extend your support to this campaign?
This is a very rarefied area of study, and it would require domain experts, and we would certainly form a request them to study that issue.
Okay, and would the IMA, sir, be willing to launch India's largest ever study into sexual predation?
It all depends on, the support structure which is available also. We will certainly put it in the working committee and then take a suitable decision.
All right, we appreciate that, sir, as long as the ball gets rolling on what we're asking for. But do you feel, sir, do you think that such a scientific study could help us build a more accurate policy or accurate laws to prevent sexual assaults?
It will all depend on the outcome of the study. If the outcome of study comes out with doable suggestions and recommendations, I think it will help the government to frame policies also.
And Mr. Ashokan, before we let you go, so one last question. We were discussing at length with Dr. Ann Burgess, who's helped the FBI pioneer its study, which has shown a great impact in terms of understanding the psychology of criminals, and they were able to identify patterns over many decades now. Do you think that perhaps certain foreign agencies can also be roped in?
Well, we should do our own studies. FBI has done it for their country. I think the Indian experts will be able to do it on our own.
Okay, all right.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.